Hey folks, I'm out walking along a road right now to bring you some unfortunate looks at some invasive species that are pretty common across Missouri and Illinois. The reason I'm out along the road instead of on a trail, on a hike in the woods, is because invasive species, which are species that are brought to a new place, so in our instance the United States from a different country, so they're not from here, they're considered exotic, but then also they have the ability to do really well. They get very aggressive, they can outcompete our native species, and they spread rapidly. So the reason we find these often along roadsides, edges of forests, edges of native habitat, is because these are areas that are often very disturbed, and some of our best invasive species really like these areas. So going along a roadside, you will be in no shortage of invasive species to look at. And we're gonna get started here. You can see in the background behind me there's a nice hedge of shrubs, and that's going to be some of the first species that we start with. Alright, I found a spot that has 4 different invasive species all right next to each other that are very common across a variety of habitats. The first one behind me here is a shrub. It's called autumn olive, Elaeagnus umbellata. It can grow 15 to 20 feet, very, very tall. You will see it smaller. It loves edges. It does not do well in shade. So you'll see it on the edges or taking over pastures, old fields, places like that. It has a bright green leaf. You can see here the underside of the leaf, the telltale, is a very silver color. So you can see these two in comparison. This is the underside, the top side. The underside of that leaf that's silver makes it really easy to recognize, especially on windy days and the leaves are kind of flapping around. This one is in bloom right now. Get you closer to some of the flowers. These flowers are very small, smaller than pinky nail size, 4-petaled, white to yellowish, cream-colored flowers. They actually smell really good. It's a little bit more subtle than some of the other spring bloomers, but they smell really nice. Unfortunately, this is a very invasive species. This was introduced as an ornamental plant in the 1800s. These white flowers will transition into red berries in the summertime. They are eaten by birds pretty heavily, and that's the way that the seed gets distributed around, is by the birds eating the berries and then depositing the seeds in their droppings elsewhere, so it moves around that way. It can be difficult to control when it gets this large. This one I'm standing under is probably 15 feet tall, so it requires a chainsaw, brush cutter maybe to remove, or even some larger equipment, especially if you're getting into big stands of it. It does respond well to herbicide, so you could do a cut stump treatment for it. When they get this large, you don't really want to spray the leaves, do a foliar application, because that obviously will have a lot of off-site effects. It's such a large shrub. You would end up getting herbicide on a lot of other plants. So this one does require cutting, removing the brush, but herbicide use on it is effective. I'm going to go right next to that one to another very large shrub. One that people probably know more commonly. This one here is a nice pale green color. You can see right now it's not yet flowering, but it has its flower buds forming. This is Lonicera mackii, which is bush honeysuckle. You see this a lot. It forms hedges along roads quite a bit. It's a nice medium green color here. The undersides are almost the same color, just a little bit more pale. The new growth of the twigs is usually this nice pinkish red color. It forms white to yellow flowers that a lot of people really like. In fact, this was also introduced for ornamental purposes. People still have it in their landscaping, even though it is highly, highly aggressive and invasive. But the white yellow flowers smell absolutely wonderful. You've probably seen many honeysuckle scented products around, and that's from this plant. The white yellow flowers bloom, I would say May, June, and even into July. Then they will be replaced by red berries that ripen in September. Also distributed by birds. They're heavily eaten by birds and the seeds carried around that way. A woody shrub, so it does, when it gets large, like this one here, that is over my head, will require a chainsaw, brush saw, maybe even heavier equipment to remove large patches of it. Also just entirely outcompetes other species. Nothing will be growing underneath it. So it's really aggressive, really detrimental to the native flora that's around. Herbicide is very effective for it. Also, you want to do a cut stump treatment on this. You can do foliar applications of herbicide on the small shrubs, but definitely not anything this large. Again, you're going to have off-target effects, and you really do not want that. So this one is bush honeysuckle. And we are going to move down to a relative of that one. Now I'm going to have to crouch down for this one. It's much lower growing. We're looking at this plant here. So this one here is Japanese honeysuckle. So it's also Lonicera japonica. I'm going to have to be careful. There's some poison ivy intergrown with it. But this is the vining version of the bush honeysuckle. So it grows on vines. You can see they are very red colored stems. Very noticeable in comparison to the green colored leaves. Again, it's just a medium colored leaf. Nice elliptic shape to them. They're actually semi-evergreen, so they'll hold their leaves and they'll stay a decently green color through a good portion of the winter. In the springtime, they'll drop some of them to put on their new growth, but you call that a semi-evergreen. They're actually also a polymorphic leaf, so we can see while these are a nice oval shape with entire margins to them, if we go down here, we have some other leaves that look like they are toothed. So polymorphic means it just has variable leaf shape, which can be a little bit confusing, especially early in the spring. I tend to notice it more. I think it's those shade leaves tend to have that variable shape to them that can make it difficult to identify. But the red vine is pretty obvious against the green leaves. This, I believe, was introduced more for erosion control in the 1800s. Definitely does not do a good job at controlling erosion, unfortunately, but it can be quite aggressive. It's a vine, so it can cover trees and shrubs and kind of take over that way, similar to how something like kudzu would do. It's definitely receptive to your systemic herbicides, but being a vine, it's a little bit more difficult. If you have small infestations, you can hand pull it, but you can't. It's a little bit harder to do cutting the stems to treat those little stems with herbicide. It tends to require foliar application to their leaves of herbicide. Small populations, though, you can definitely hand pull. It requires checking on it repeatedly, and even with herbicide, you have to. I think you're probably best off spraying twice a year because it's just that aggressive in those vines with those rhizomes underground. Do a good job at surviving. That's why we have so much of it. And we're gonna scoot over just a tiny bit to take a look at another plant species. So we have one here that's actually quite thorny. The car just drove by, sorry about the noise. But this one here is much smaller with tiny leaves. I'd like to pull one of these off for you, but pretty pokey. So this one here is multiflora rose, which is Rosa multiflora. That's the Latin name, easy to remember. Introduced for its rootstock because it has such great roots to it. They brought it over to the U.S. in the mid-1800s to graft ornamental roses to the rootstock to help them survive and do well. Unfortunately, it escaped from people's rose gardens and has taken over a lot of woods, open areas. It forms thickets that are completely impenetrable because of the sharp thorns on the canes. The canes are often a reddish color, especially in the springtime. And if you look at these leaflets, so the entire leaf is this small stem here with these 7 small leaves on it. So that whole thing is called a leaf. It's a compound leaf. And then individually, these are called leaflets. So multiflora rose has usually between 5 to 7 leaflets on its compound leaf. That's a good way to identify it. It does bloom with a whitish pinkish flower. It's not your showy rose garden flowers. They're more like a wild rose flower. They're maybe like thumbnail sized, 5-petaled. They are pretty, but unfortunately it's invasive. Those flowers then get replaced by your typical rose hip. It's a pretty small size rose hip, just like you would expect to see in any other rose species. You can treat it with herbicide, but it's similar to the Japanese honeysuckle in that it has these small canes, so it's difficult to cut and just treat that little stem. It's probably more effective and easier for large infestations of it to do a foliar or leaf application of an herbicide. You can hand pull, especially like with a small one like this. You need really nice thick gloves, actually like the rose gardening gloves, and you can rip it out of the ground, especially in the spring when the ground's really wet. But it's a difficult one. It's frustrating to be walking through the woods and come through big thickets of this. It's difficult to get through. So that one was multiflora rose. And now we're going to move just a little further down the road to a tree species, or true tree species that is invasive. All right, I spotted another species here, the tree species I mentioned that is invasive. It's the leaves are poking out of a nice dense shrubbery of bush honeysuckle here. But you can see they stand out. Definitely a different species here with these reddish colored shiny leaves on the edge. This one here is a young tree. This is called Ailanthus altissima, which is tree of heaven. Very nice sounding name. It's a nice horticultural name it was given. It was introduced as an ornamental species. Unfortunately, it's really taken over areas that don't get mowed regularly, old fields and edges. Like I mentioned, this is a small one and they're just starting to leaf out right now. So that's why we have this reddish pink colored leaflets. This is just like the multiflora rose, where this entire piece here, and actually I'm gonna break this off, I don't worry about hurting it. This entire piece here is the leaf. And then let me flip it upside down. And then each one of these is called a leaflet. So this is a compound leaf. These are remarkable. This species can have leaves get up to 1 to 4 feet long. So this has the potential, right now, I don't know, maybe it's about 8 inches long. It has the potential to reach 4 feet in length. And you can see, you can tell it's still growing. These are all really bunched up here. And new little leaflets are still developing at the edges. It's crazy. It almost reminds you of some like palm tree or something, how the length of these. And so each leaf will contain, I believe it's between 10 and 41 leaflets. That seems weird and really specific, but it is important in identification. You know, if it had only 7 or 9 leaflets, it might be a hickory. I don't know any tree species that's native or that we have in the US that has more than 41 leaflets. Maybe the honey locust potentially, but I even doubt that there. 41 leaflets is a lot. But if you can imagine this reaching 4 feet in length for one leaf, that's pretty remarkable. I'm gonna move to a spot where I have a better stem for you to see. These grow really tall and erect, and you can see this one right in front of me. That is a tree of heaven there, and that one in the background is a tree of heaven. So they grow really straight. They're actually clonal species, so they reproduce underground very, very well. So you can actually get really big stands of tree of heaven, very fast growing. I believe they can reach up somewhere like 70, 80 feet tall. And they do it quickly, so it's unfortunate. They can take over an area pretty quick. If we look at the bark, it's just your kind of a grayish brown bark. It has these little lenticels, these white dots on the bark. This I would call a very young tree also. It can be a many trunked, but each trunk can be very large, get very wide. But this one here is very easily larger than my thumb already, and this is a large tree. If I'm able to pull this down, we can take a look. Oops, sorry about that. We can take a look at the leaf scars there. They are even larger than my thumbnail. So those are really big leaf scars. I can't think of any of our native tree species that have that. And what's odd is that they start leafing out first at the end there. This one actually looks like it was damaged by the frost. So that kind of killed those leaves back, but you could see more buds coming on at each leaf scar there. And nothing else looks like this. They have these really fat stems. Wrestle with this so you can see how fat they are all the way at the end of the twig. And so the twigs up in the trees are this big, and that again is something that makes it easily recognizable. Most twigs are much tiny, maybe pinky sized or smaller. So this is tree of heaven. Once you learn it, once you see it in person, it's really easy to spot, especially with the size of those leaves that they have and how fat these stems are. It's a very aggressive species. It does have to be treated with herbicide. You cannot simply hand pull it unless it's a very new infestation because of those rhizomes underground. If those underground rhizomes break off, then and you don't get it all out of the ground, they'll just resprout. So pulling it by hand can be really ineffective. And there is a stand of it here. You probably can't see it well, but we have some leaves there. You see how thick these stems are. That's tree of heaven. So tree of heaven, not a good one. Again, you want to do everything you can to remove it. It would require chainsaw, some sort of saw, brush cutter, and herbicide applications. All right, now I am at another spot that has a really terrible invasive plant species that is what we would call a forb or a herbaceous plant. You can see it's this one here. It has small 4-petaled white flowers that form in clusters at the tips of stems. This plant I'm standing next to now is probably, I don't know, 2.5, 3 feet tall. This one is called garlic mustard. It's Alaria petiolata. It is in the mustard family. It is a species that was brought to the U.S. From Europe, I believe even Western Asia is where it's native to, but it was brought with, it was used in gardens. It's an edible plant actually. If you break the leaves, it has a very garlicky smell to it. Unfortunately though, this plant is very aggressive in the United States. It likes woodland areas. It can completely blanket forest floors. a couple things that are unfortunate about it. Number one is that the seeds that form on this plant and these long areas here, they have approximately, I believe it's about a 10-year lifespan. So after the seed is dropped from the plant, it can continue to live in the seed bank, in the soil for up to 10 years. So it makes it really hard to eradicate. Also, this plant is something that you would call allelopathic. It has the ability, it produces a chemical that it releases into the soil that inhibits the growth of other plants around it. So this makes it particularly problematic because not only does it outcompete our native plant species, but it also produces a chemical so that they can't even simply grow. They can't give any sort of a fighting chance. It's really, really aggressive. It does produce a lot of seeds. Management techniques for this one of the most basic things and the easiest things that it's done is you just pull it out of the ground. It has these really shallow root systems, really easy to pull out of the ground. It is a biennial plant, so in the first year it just produces a basal rosette, which is just basically these leaves at the bottom here. You can see that sorry if I could zoom in correctly, you can see that these leaves are heart-shaped, and they are scalloped at the edges. And so it just has these leaves at the bottom of the plant in its first year. It then overwinters, and in its second year, it shoots up this tall plant. Like I said, it could get up to 3 feet tall probably. And so the second year, they're really easy to pull because you have this long stalk, but you can even pull them as basal rosettes. And I don't see any rosettes around, but here's an example of a really small one. So they don't always get tall, right? Like their second year, they just kind of work with what they have and get as tall as they can. But this guy's pretty small. He's not even a foot tall. Really easy to pull out of the ground, like I said. So since this is a biennial, you don't necessarily have to pull the roots out this year because it doesn't really have much regrowth potential from the roots, but they pull up easy. A common practice is to bag the entire plant because we're worried that there have been scientific studies that show that even after you pull the plant, when the roots attach, that it is still able to output seed. So a lot of people bag them into like big 40-gallon garbage bags and then throw them out that way, and hopefully with the heat inside the bag that they get cooked. All right, that wraps up my roadside invasive species walk, which is really quite easy. I didn't have to travel very far, but these are the places that you very commonly find invasive species. Unfortunately, they do make their way into the interior woods, into your pastures, into your prairie areas, even into your landscaping and lawn areas. So they are a problem. It's worth every bit of effort that you can to remove them from your property. It does require checking on them periodically and coming back to treat them, but it's well worth it because they are very harmful to our ecosystems. They even impact our economy. So we want to do everything that we can to get rid of them. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks. Bye.